I hadn't seen my son Michael in 6 weeks. When his wife called, not him, to let me know about the recital, Claire's voice on the phone was careful, measured. The way someone speaks when they're choosing each word around an obstacle course. Sophie would really love for you to be there, Frank, she's been asking. She paused. Brandon's mother will be there too. I just wanted you to know. That pause told me everything. I drove down from Asheville to their house in Myers Park, Charlotte, on a Saturday morning in November. 64 years old, retired, living simply in the mountains. I'd made the drive a dozen times since Michael and Claire married 7 years ago, and each time the house looked a little more like it belonged to the Hargrove family, and a little less like it belonged to my son. The Hargroves were Charlotte money, old enough to have a foundation named after them, new enough to still need people to know about it. Brandon's mother, Diane Hargrove, ran Hargrove Event Planning, a company she mentioned within the first 4 minutes of any conversation. She had the kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never having been told no in a room that mattered. Michael met me at the door. He looked thinner. Not unhealthy, just compressed. Like something was pressing on him from multiple directions, and he'd learned to take up less space. Dad, he hugged me, and I felt the effort behind it, the effort to seem fine. Glad you made it. Wouldn't miss Sophie's recital, I said. He nodded, but his eyes moved past me toward the street, checking something. Claire appeared behind him, and she smiled with genuine relief when she saw me. Sophie came running from the hallway, stopped herself halfway, then walked the rest of the way with exaggerated composure. Grandpa Frank. She hugged my waist. I have a solo part. A solo part, I said. That calls for a very serious audience member. She giggled and ran back down the hall. Claire watched her go with that particular expression parents wear when they're memorizing a moment, because they're not sure how many more like it they'll have. Then she looked at me. She's been practicing so hard, Frank. She really has. Diane Hargrove arrived 40 minutes later with the energy of someone hosting an event she hadn't been invited to organize but intended to anyway. She came through the door ahead of her son Brandon, surveying the living room with the quick professional eye of someone assessing a venue. Claire, the flowers on the mantel are asymmetrical. She set down her bag and began adjusting them without asking. It reads as careless. She noticed me then. Frank. Not hello. Just my name, delivered like a notation. Diane, I said. She looked at me for a moment the way people look at furniture they're considering donating. Then she moved on to find Brandon, who had appeared behind her with the defeated posture of a man who had been carrying his mother's luggage metaphorically and otherwise for his entire adult life. I'd watched Diane operate at family gatherings for 7 years. She was precise and consistent. She never raised her voice, never said anything that couldn't technically be defended as helpful, and systematically ensured that everyone within her orbit understood their rank. Claire was perpetually one decision away from disappointment. Michael was an acceptable placeholder for a son-in-law, provided he deferred appropriately. Sophie was a project, not a child, and I was background noise. A retired man from the mountains who, as Diane had once explained to her bridge club within my earshot, had never quite built anything. That was fine. I had learned long ago that people who need others to feel small usually have very specific reasons for that need. I'd spent 31 years watching that particular psychology from a distance that gave me a clear view. We drove to the recital hall separately. The Davidson Academy Performing Arts building held maybe 60 seats, a proper little theater with a real stage and curtain. Sophie's dance class had been rehearsing a piece from the Nutcracker, 8-year-olds in burgundy costumes. I found a seat in the 3rd row next to Claire. Michael sat beside me. Brandon and Diane settled 2 seats down. I watched Sophie in the wings before the lights dimmed. She was scanning the audience with that particular child's search pattern, methodically checking each face until she found the ones that mattered. When she found mine, she waved with her whole arm. I held up both thumbs. The performance started well. Sophie's class came on in the 2nd number. She was in the front row, and from the moment she stepped out, I could see she'd internalized every count. Her feet were precise, her arms clean, and she had the expression of someone doing something they'd chosen freely. She was 2 minutes into the piece when it happened. Diane stood up. I didn't understand what she was doing at first. She moved along the row toward the aisle, and I assumed she was stepping out. But she walked toward the stage, not the exit. She moved to the steps at the side, climbed them without hesitation, crossed to Sophie mid-performance, and took hold of her wrist. The music kept playing. The other children faltered, confused. Sophie looked up at her grandmother with an expression I recognized, the same expression Claire wore when Diane entered a room and allowed herself to be pulled to the side curtain and off the stage. The music faded. The teacher appeared from the wings, face-stricken, clearly unsure what to do with a situation the parent handbook had not covered. I heard Diane's voice from behind the curtain, carrying in the way voices do in proper theater acoustics. "You were turning the wrong direction on every count. I was watching from the house. You were making the whole group look bad. You can go back out when you're ready to do it correctly." Sophie did not come back out. The class finished the piece without her. In the row, Brandon leaned toward Michael. Sophie was embarrassing herself anyway. Mom saved her from making it worse. Michael said nothing. I watched his jaw tighten and then release. The way someone lets go of something they've decided isn't worth the cost. Claire was already standing, moving toward the stage steps. I put my hand briefly on her arm. "I'll go." She looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but recognition. I walked to the stage steps and found Sophie in the wing, sitting on a prop trunk with her knees pulled up. Diane was crouched in front of her, demonstrating the turn with hand movements. Sophie's face was the careful blank that children learn when they've understood that emotions are inconvenient. "Give us a minute," I said to Diane. She looked up with the expression of someone whose competence is being questioned in their area of expertise. "Frank, I'm in the middle of correcting her. I can see that. Give us a minute." The evenness of my voice did something unexpected. Diane stood and stepped back, not because she wanted to, but because she hadn't prepared for that particular register. I sat down next to Sophie on the prop trunk. "You were doing beautifully," I said. "I was turning the wrong way." Her voice was very flat. She'd already accepted the verdict. "You were turning the way your teacher taught you. I watched every rehearsal video you sent me. You were doing it exactly right." She looked at me for a long moment. Then her chin wobbled, just once, before she pressed it still. "I didn't get to finish," she said. "I know. I practiced every day. I know that too." I kept my voice steady. Somewhere in my chest was something that was not steady at all. But I had learned over many years that the moment requiring the most control is usually the one that feels the least controllable. I excused myself calmly, walked back through the wing, out the side door of the theater, and stood in the parking lot in the November air. I took out my phone. My hands were not shaking. They were deliberate. The first call took 40 seconds. The second call took 3 minutes. Then I went back inside, found my seat, and watched the rest of the program. After the recital, we gathered in the lobby for the reception. Sophie stood beside Claire, eating a sugar cookie with the mechanical attention of someone performing normalcy. Diane circulated among the other parents with the ease of someone at her own party. Brandon helped himself to the refreshment table. Michael stood near the wall with a plastic cup of punch, looking at a spot on the floor. I stood next to him. "How long?" I asked quietly. He knew what I meant. He didn't pretend otherwise. "It's gotten worse in the past year, since her business expanded. She's here almost every weekend." He paused. "Claire wanted to say something tonight. I talked her out of it. I thought it would make things worse." What did Claire want to say? That Sophie has been asking not to have sleepovers at Diane's anymore. That she comes home quiet. He looked at his punch. That she started flinching when adults raised their voices. I thought about the blank expression on Sophie's face in the wing. The practiced stillness of it. "Your daughter was performing something she loved," I said. "She was doing it correctly. She was pulled off stage in front of her class, her teacher, and every parent in that room. And her father didn't move." He looked at me then, and I saw something that had been pressed down for a long time. "Dad, I know. Knowing isn't the same as acting. I don't know how to. She's Brandon's mother. And Brandon follows his mother," I finished. "Yes, I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" "In the parking lot. I saw you leave. I made some calls." "To who?" "People who needed to know some things." On the drive back to the house, Sophie sat between Claire and me in the back seat. She'd been quiet since the lobby. About halfway home, without looking up from her lap, she said, "Grandpa Frank, was I really turning the wrong way?" "No," I said. You were turning exactly the right way. She thought about this. Then why did Grandma Diane? Because sometimes people are very sure they're right about things they haven't looked at carefully enough. She considered that, with the serious attention children give to explanations, they're trying to file somewhere permanent. Then she leaned against my arm and didn't say anything else until we reached the house. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, the four adults sat in the kitchen with the careful silence of people who have been circling something for too long. Diane held a glass of wine and wore the settled expression of someone who had handled a situation competently and expected acknowledgement. Brandon scrolled through his phone. Claire sat with both hands around her mug, not drinking. Michael finally spoke. "Mom Diane, what you did tonight at the recital, you can't." I corrected my granddaughter's technique before she embarrassed herself further. "You're welcome." She was crying in the wing. Children cry when they're corrected. That's how they learn. Your generation has confused cruelty with honesty and kindness with avoidance. She looked at Claire. Sophie needs structure. She needs someone willing to hold her to a standard. I am trying to give her that. Claire set down her mug. Diane. She's 8 years old. She practiced that piece for 6 months. She wasn't embarrassing herself. She was dancing. Diane's expression took on the particular sharpness it wore when someone she'd underestimated pushed back. Claire. I've been organizing children's performances for 20 years through my company. I think I can recognize when a child is... This isn't one of your events, Claire said quietly. She's our daughter. Brandon looked up from his phone. Babe, I think Mom is just trying to help. She knows a lot about... She pulled our child off a stage, Michael said. The flatness in his voice was new. I'd been watching for it. The room went quiet. I set down my coffee cup. I'd like to say something, if that's all right. I looked at Diane. I want to tell you a little about myself, since I don't think you've ever been particularly curious. She met my eyes with the tolerant expression she used for situations she found mildly tedious. Frank, I spent 31 years as a special agent with the FBI. Retired as Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Charlotte Field Office in 2019. I let that sit for a moment. My last 12 years, I ran white-collar crime investigations, financial fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. You develop a particular eye for certain patterns. The silence changed quality. Brandon looked up from his phone. Diane's expression remained composed, but something behind it recalibrated. In the parking lot tonight, I made a call to my former colleague who now runs compliance oversight at the North Carolina Secretary of State's office. I described some things I've observed about Hargrove event planning over the past few years. The vendor markup practices, the subcontractor arrangements, the way the corporate structure seems to shift between tax years. I kept my voice conversational. She found it interesting enough to pull the public filings tonight. She'll be following up on Monday. That's Brandon put down his phone. That's harassment. You can't. I reported information to the appropriate regulatory body. That's not harassment. That's a civic responsibility I take seriously. I looked at him evenly. I also placed a second call to a family law attorney I worked with closely on several cases. She specializes in situations involving children who show behavioral signs consistent with ongoing psychological distress in family environments. I paused. She's going to reach out to Claire tomorrow. Diane set down her wine glass with a precision that suggested considerable internal effort. Are you threatening me? I'm describing phone calls I made. The first was to report what I believe are legitimate regulatory concerns that existed before tonight. The second was to connect my son and daughter-in-law with a resource that may be useful to them. I looked at her. Tonight, you publicly humiliated an 8-year-old in front of her peers, her teacher, and 40 parents. You've done smaller versions of that every time I've watched you with her. I've been watching a long time. You have no idea what you're... I know exactly what I'm talking about, Diane. I spent 31 years learning how to look at what's in front of me without letting what I want to see get in the way. I stood and picked up my cup. I'm going to say goodnight to my granddaughter. I'd suggest you both think carefully about the choices ahead of you. I walked down the hallway. Behind me, the kitchen stayed very quiet. Sophie was still awake, sitting up in bed with her astronomy book open, the one I'd given her for her birthday. She had a small star map spread across her knees. Can't sleep? I sat in the chair beside her bed. I keep thinking about the recital. What do you keep thinking? I keep thinking about what I would have done differently if I'd had more time. She smoothed the edge of her star map. I think I would have kept going, even if she was pulling me. I think I should have kept dancing. I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment. You're right, I said. That's exactly what you should have done. She nodded, filing this away. Grandpa Frank, what did you do in your job? I found people who did things they shouldn't have done, and I made sure they faced the right consequences. Like a detective? Something like that. She thought about this. Did the bad people always know you were coming? Almost never. She smiled at that, just a little. Good. I kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. The next morning, Diane and Brandon left early. There was no confrontation, no dramatic departure. Diane was civil, in the way people are civil when they're processing a situation they haven't fully mapped yet. Brandon carried bags to the car without looking at anyone directly. The goodbye at the door was brief. After their car left the driveway, Claire stood in the front doorway for a long moment. Then she said, I've wanted to ask her to stop coming every weekend for 2 years. I didn't know how. You know how now, I said. She looked at me. Frank, 31 years FBI and you never said anything. You were raising a family. You needed a grandfather, not a credential. I watched Sophie through the front window, already in the backyard with a stick, drawing something in the dirt. They treated you the way they did because they thought I was nobody. I let them think that. People show you who they are when they believe there's no cost to it. She was quiet for a moment. What happens now? With the regulatory thing, Hargrove Event Planning has been operating with some structural irregularities for several years. I noticed them 3 years ago when I looked into the company out of curiosity. I didn't act on it until there was a reason. I paused. Whatever comes of it will come from the facts of the situation, not from me. Michael appeared behind Claire. He'd slept, and he looked different for it, as if something that had been held rigid had been allowed to loosen slightly. He handed me a cup of coffee. Dad, I owe you an apology. You don't. I've been watching this happen to Claire and Sophie for 3 years. I kept thinking if I just navigated it carefully enough, didn't rock the boat, you were trying to protect your family the way you knew how. The way changed last night. I accepted the coffee. Now you know another way. The attorney my former colleague had recommended called Claire that afternoon. They spoke for over an hour. By the time I drove back to Asheville, Claire had a consultation scheduled and a clarity in her voice that hadn't been there the day before. The weeks that followed had the methodical quality of things that have been set in motion and allowed to proceed. The Secretary of State's Compliance Office opened a formal review of Hargrove Event Planning in the 3rd week of November. It was not a dramatic event. A letter arrived. Records were requested. The ordinary machinery of accountability began to turn. Brandon called Michael twice in the 1st week. The first call was threats. The second call was something more complicated, a version of Brandon that Michael said sounded like someone waking up slowly in a dark room. Not sure yet what they were waking up to. Diane called me once. I answered. You've made your point, she said. This isn't about a point, Diane. It's about a child who practiced a dance for 6 months and was pulled off stage in front of everyone she knew. I know what you were trying to do. I watched you do smaller versions of it for 7 years. The intention doesn't change the effect. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want from me? I want you to stop treating my granddaughter as a project and start treating her as a person. I want you to consider that your certainty about the correct way to raise children may have some limits. And I want you to get yourself a very good accountant. I heard something on the other end that might have been a short exhale. You're not at all what I thought you were. No, I'm not. The compliance review of Hargrove Event Planning took 4 months. It uncovered a pattern of underreported subcontractor income and inflated expense deductions that had been consistent for 6 years. The penalties were significant, not ruinous, but enough to require a serious restructuring and a conversation with a tax attorney that Diane had presumably not anticipated having. Her business didn't close, but it changed shape considerably. Several clients quietly took their events elsewhere once the news circulated in the way these things circulate in Charlotte. The Foundation Gala contract she'd held for 9 consecutive years was not renewed. Brandon, in the process of watching his mother's certainties disassemble, seemed to undergo something I hadn't expected. A period of genuine reconsideration. He started a therapist in January. He told Michael in February that he'd been raised to believe his mother's judgment was authoritative. and that he'd never examined that belief because he'd never needed to. He said it the way someone says something they've arrived at carefully and aren't sure yet how to put down. Michael told me about that conversation on a Sunday afternoon when he and Sophie had come up to Asheville to visit. Sophie was in the backyard with the telescope I'd set up on the deck, scanning the tree line for whatever she could find in the November sky. Michael sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug, and he said, "He's trying, Dad." "I think he actually is. People can change," I said. "Not always, but sometimes." "Do you think Diane?" "Time will tell about Diane." He nodded slowly. "You know what Claire said to me last week? She said she feels like she got her husband back." He looked at the table. I didn't realize how far I'd drifted until someone showed me where I'd started. I didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. Sophie appeared at the back door. "Grandpa Frank, I can see Jupiter. Come look." I pushed back from the table. The planet hung in the eyepiece, pale and distinct, the faint suggestion of bands across its face if you looked with the right patience. Sophie stood beside me with her star map, cross-referencing, making a small note in the margin with the stub of pencil she kept tucked in the wire spiral. "Did you know Jupiter has 79 moons?" she said. "I did not know that. My teacher said most of them don't even have names yet. Just numbers." She considered this. "I think that's sad." "Why?" "Because everything that exists deserves a name. That's how you know someone noticed it." I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment. 8 years old, standing in the mountain dark with a star map and a pencil, making sure things got noticed. "You're right about that," I said. By spring, Michael and Claire had established what Claire called new terms with Diane visits by invitation. No unannounced arrivals. No correction of Sophie without parental discussion first. Diane had agreed with a stiffness that suggested she was complying more than she was convinced. But compliance and conviction don't always arrive together. And sometimes one precedes the other, if you give it enough time. Sophie's dance class held a makeup performance in March for the families who'd been at the November recital. The studio teacher had apparently been moved enough by what happened to organize it specifically. Sophie had a solo again, slightly longer than the original. I drove down from Asheville the night before and stayed in the guest room that had started to feel less like a guest room and more like a regular place I inhabited. Sophie showed me her practice that evening in the living room, in socks on the hardwood floor, counting under her breath with total concentration. She didn't miss a turn. At the performance, I sat in the front row. Michael on my left, Claire on my right. Diane and Brandon were there too, in the row behind, and I was aware of them the way you're aware of weather, noting it, without being governed by it. When Sophie came out, she found my face immediately, the way she always did. I held up both thumbs. She danced. The entire piece. Every count. Every turn. Every arm position. She didn't look at the wings once. She looked at the audience with the clear-eyed presence of someone who had decided they had a right to be exactly where they were. When she finished, the room applauded. Sophie stood straight, breathed, and then broke into the enormous, unguarded smile of a child who has just discovered that the thing they were afraid of was smaller than they thought. On the drive home, she sat between Michael and me again, and somewhere around the third traffic light she said, without preamble, "Grandpa Frank." I kept going this time. "You did," I said, even though it was scary, even though. She seemed satisfied with this. She looked out the window at the passing lights. Then, "Is that what you did? In your job? You kept going even when it was scary?" I thought about 31 years of that particular discipline, about the cases that ran cold and the ones that broke open at 3 in the morning, about sitting across from people who believed with complete conviction that they would never face consequences, and watching the moment that conviction cracked. "That's exactly what I did," I said. She nodded and leaned against my arm. "I'm going to do that too. Whatever I end up being." "I know you are," I said. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone to sleep and Michael had gone to check on her, Claire and I sat on the back porch with tea. The April night was soft and mild. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was making an unhurried case for something. "Frank," she said, "I need to ask you something I've been holding for a while." "Ask." "All those years. Diane calling you nobody. Acting like Michael had settled for less when he chose this family. All the small things, every time. And she paused. You just let her. You never said anything." "No." "Why?" I thought about how to say the thing I'd known for a long time. Because people who need others to feel powerless will tell you everything about themselves if you let them keep talking. Every condescension, every assumption, every way they reveal the structure of what they think the world owes them. I held the mug in both hands. I could have corrected Diane's impression of me any time in 7 years, told her what I'd done, what I knew, who would return my calls. But the moment I did that, she'd have adjusted. She'd have shown me her careful face instead of her real one. Claire thought about that. So you waited. I waited until there was a reason not to. Until Sophie. She was quiet for a while. A light came on in the upstairs window. Michael, checking the hallway. The dog in the neighborhood reached some kind of resolution and fell silent. She asked me last week, Claire said, what Grandpa Frank did when he was working. I told her he helped make sure people followed the rules. She thought about it and said Claire smiled. She said, that makes sense. He's very patient. I looked out at the backyard where Sophie's telescope still stood on its tripod from the afternoon. 8 years old. Patient. Already paying attention to things that hadn't been named yet. Making sure they got noticed. That girl, I said, is going to be just fine. Claire leaned her head back against the chair. We all are, above us. The stars were doing what stars do, burning at enormous distance. Visible only because the night was dark enough to see them. I finished my tea and stayed a while longer. Because there was nowhere else I needed to be. If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel,